Our guest of the day, presenter of the day, Andrew Davis is back. Andrew is a good friend of the Cobb Institute. He has taught for us. He has spoken here many times. He's a frequent presenter. He is a process philosopher, theologian, scholar, he says, of cosmological wonder. He is the program director for the Center for Process Studies, where he researches, writes, teaches, and organizes conferences on various aspects of process relational thought. He's an advocate of metaphysics and meaning in a hospitable universe, and approaches philosophy as the endeavor to systematically think through what reality must be like because we are a part of it. Most recently here at Cobb and Friends, he gave a presentation with Stephen Dick about his new book, Metaphysics of EXO-LIFE, toward a constructive Whiteheadian cosmotheology. But today, he's going to dive in a little deeper to the appendix of the book. In that section, he offers a history of process theology and extraterrestrial life, including key statements that are made by a variety of process thinkers and a summary of key affirmative points. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to both Jay and Andrew to carry us through the rest of our time together. Jay?
Well, I'd like to very quickly turn it over to Andrew with an inaugurating comment by John Cobb about the importance of Andrew in the process movement as a whole. And then, Andrew, we just can't wait to hear what you have to say, and I'll facilitate discussion after that. John, you want to open us up with a word?
Okay. Well, I think we're extremely fortunate that a person like Andrew was attracted to us and has found in process thought the key. I think there are thousands of people who might do that if they came to it in the right way, and I think the likelihood of that becoming common is increasing. So, Andrew, I think you might be the leader of a whole development in the intellectual, cultural life of this country that would be very positive. There may be only 1 million at times 1 million of a chance of that, but there is a chance.
Oh, thank you, John. I appreciate that. And thank you, Jay. All right. Well, hello to everyone. Should I say earthlings of the Cobb Institute. It's great to be with you all again. I'm going to share my screen with everyone here. And I assume you can all see that now. Is that correct?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Well, it's great to be back with you all again. And Richard, thanks for those opening comments, which set me up with the journey that I'm going to be taking us on today, which is process theology and extraterrestrial life history. And so a lot of this today is going to be recounting some of a fascinating history that I've been uncovering over the last couple of years. It's a history really that is, I'm not certainly not all inclusive, right? But we're going to be looking at certain bold points of the relevance of process theology to what really is an emerging discussion that has quite a bit of energy behind it. The question of other worlds, the question of extraterrestrial life. So I might begin by just informing you all of a number of recent texts that have been emerging in the last several years. These first five, as just an example, have emerged in the last several years, last 5 years. Pardon that interruption. So I list this just to give you a sense of the energy that's been emerging surrounding this topic in the last earliest 5 years, the text at the top, but even going back to some 20 years. Texts have been emerging and operating out of different philosophical and theological frameworks with respect to this question of other worlds and extraterrestrial life. These texts offer justifications philosophically and theologically for considering the topic. They also offer histories of considerations of the implications that might be involved in discovering wide-ranging life in the universe. So it's a medley of really fantastic texts. I would encourage all of these texts to you. And what one notices when you get into this text is a certain neglect that has been suffered with respect to some of the resources, some of the relevance of process theology with respect to the topic. So I won't say it's been an absolute neglect. Okay? You will find scant mention here and there of Whitehead, certainly more mention of Teilhard himself, who said quite a bit more on the topic than Whitehead. And occasionally you'll get a mention of a process theologian here and there, but really there has been no sustained treatment of the topic from within the possibilities that process thought and that Whitehead's thinking allows. And I don't know about you, but I find that unfortunate. I think it is unfortunate for at least two reasons here. So the first I would suggest is the fact that process theology has always been a tradition of cosmic theological reflection. In fact, to quote John Cobb and David Griffin here, they say that process theology intends to think through the meaning for our existence and actions of the space-time scales that scientific cosmology suggests. Now, inherently wedded to these modern space-time scales is this question, this fundamental question as to whether life and mind is alone or lonely in the universe, or whether or not, as Stephen Dick would have it, that we inhabit a biological universe, that is one where life and mind is replete. Now, the second reason I think this neglect of process thought is unfortunate is because process philosophers, process theologians have not been silent on the topic. Okay, and in part, my work is trying to make this known in more of a significant sense. So we will demonstrate today, at least in part, that we have all manner of openness, wonder, and affirmation belonging to the tradition of process theology and process philosophy. And moreover, that this wonder, I think, in a number of key process thinkers extends from the textual, from the source foundations of at least the modern pioneers of process philosophy and process theology. And here I think of specifically A.N. Whitehead here pictured on the right, and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin pictured here on the left. Both wonderful images, AI generated. And I include them because it's not well known either that Whitehead himself was open to this discussion. Teilhard, as I mentioned, was certainly far more open to it, involved theologically into the discussion in ways that I think are growing now as this literature continues to expand. So as just as an example of the openness of these two foundational pillars, Teilhard notes that, or speculates rather, that at an average of at least one human race, or what he calls an extraterrestrial mankind per galaxy, that would make at least millions of human races dotted all over the heavens. And it certainly could be far more than that as well. Now, Whitehead shows a comparable openness, at least as recorded by Lucian Price in his book, Dialogues of Alfred North Whitehead, where Whitehead is quoted as saying, "The forms of life which might be lived on other stars, millions of light years away and millions hence, could be infinite and admit every possibility that the imagination could conceive." So it's a wonderful and similar kind of statement from these two foundational pillars. Teilhard, again, far more theologically involved in this discussion, and note his comment. He says, "There is no question of having to begin work on a theology for these unknown worlds, these unknown planets." And I think that's a significant statement because it's an early indication, an early call, if you want, for the development of a kind of process, philosophical or theological exo-theology. And it's a statement that is now being made in a lot of the current literature. So Teilhard has the wisdom to start asking this question early on, and to do so based on certain philosophical and theological foundations. So this is important that these two foundational figures are open to this. We're going to see other process theologians writing in their wake, also being open to this. And at least in part, my recent work in the last couple of years has wanted to make up for the scholarly lacuna with respect to the relevance and reach of process thought for this discussion. So as Richard already mentioned, my recent book here on the left, Metaphysics of EXO-LIFE, is a conversation with Stephen J. Dick and what he calls his naturalistic cosmotheology. And that's a conversation that we had live here with the Cobb Institute. I think that was perhaps last year, Richard. So you can find it there. But as he mentioned, what we're going to be focusing on today is Appendix A, which documents a certain history with respect to this question that I think is important and needs to be much more widely known. I point also to a forthcoming book that Roland Faber and I are editing, Astrophilosophy, Exotheology, and Cosmic Religion, Extraterrestrial Life in a Process Universe. And this is a much larger project, of which a lot of the work in my recent book, Metaphysics of EXO-LIFE, is just a chapter. So this book houses 15, 16 different scholars across process thought commenting on the scientific ramifications, the philosophical and theological ramifications of taking a process-oriented view of the universe and what that means for some of these large questions of life beyond Earth. So it's quite a large volume. It's going to be over 600 pages and probably a bit expensive, unfortunately. But I do hope you'll take interest in both texts and see the ways in which we're trying to make inroads into this conversation. Well, where are we going to head today in terms of the history? Again, it's not going to be an exhaustive history, but what I do want to comment on is some significant figures, bold points of this history and some of their commentary. So as a quick breeze through before we jump into each in more detail, Henry Nelson Wyman, Charles Hartshorne, Lewis Ford, Norman Pittenger, John Cobb, certainly, and Cobb's relationship to David Griffin, although we'll also see some Griffin's comments on his own. Cobb, as many of you will know, also collaborated with Charles Birch. We'll see some statements that they make together. We'll look to Nicholas Rescher. We'll look to the collaboration between Chandra Wickramasinghe and Theodore Walker Jr. And then we're going to conclude with some of the recent work of Roland Faber, who's commenting anew on this topic. And as Richard mentioned, I'll also, to conclude the full discussion here, comment on some of the thematic affirmations that I see emerging from various statements in and between these figures. All right, well, let's jump to Henry Nelson Wyman first. Now, many of you may know that Wyman was, at least for a time, a contemporary of Whitehead. He has been credited as a founder of process theology, particularly as it buzzed in the Chicago school, and really its creative utilization of Whitehead's philosophical theology. So Wyman is a really important early figure when it comes to historically thinking about the origins of process thinking. He himself, he admits to being influenced by Bergson, Dewey, Alexander, and certainly Whitehead, all of which for him have this affirmation of creativity in common, right? And they use this word, he says, with different shades of meaning, but he admits to certainly being influenced by all of them. And with respect to Whitehead in particular, in Whitehead's text, his early text, Wyman notes that these books helped open a door which I had vaguely felt was there to be opened, but which Whitehead first swung wide. I consider Whitehead one of my greatest teachers, he states. Now, for our purposes, Wyman's excellent text, The Source of Human Good, 1946, is his documentation of the creative event or the creative good in the evolutionary process, which in part for him is this means by which entropy is transcended, and various shapes of value are attained in the cosmic process. So he says this increase of good that has occurred on our planet is not an accident. It's the working of a known and creative or definite reality we have described as creative good. It's a creative good that works against obstacles and overcomes them with a power qualitatively and immeasurably different than man's. He notes, moreover, that the organization and creative process at the subatomic level does not seem to be able to rise to higher levels, except in those rare instances in which life has emerged. And here we're going to see him pointing to the first triumph of the creative event, as well as signaling in an early form with respect to process thought, his openness to these triumphs also beyond our planet. He says the living cell is the first triumph of the creative event over the inertia due to this canceling out of the diverse activities of the atom and molecule. Throughout most of the universe, creativity seems to have unhalted at the level of matter's inertia. Since our knowledge of remote space is very limited, it would be rash to state that only on this planet has creative fulfillment, risen above the level of the molecule. Now, there's a certain openness here, and certainly since Wyman is writing, we know far more about our knowledge of remote space. I think of the thousands of exoplanets we've discovered, the fact that each star is thought to have planets orbiting around it, a portion of which are habitable in a certain sense, we suspect. So we see an early indication of his openness here, and he would go on to say that, well, it may be futile to speculate in this way, and that we should probably just focus our attention on our planet with respect to these questions. So it's an early indication. Now, with respect to God, he speaks of God as the creative event, and notes that this divine process of evolution makes qualities more appreciable by creative, sensitive organisms, by making them more progressively sensitive, by generating signs with meanings and producing mind, by bringing forth communication of meanings and thus establishing society, and by sustaining the continuity of history and thus accumulating meanings through the sequence of generations, right? He's sort of describing the way in which the creative event as God brings forth life, culture, and mind. And despite his attention, I might say, to our planet, there's no reason on Wyman's scheme to restrict these comments to simply our planet. In fact, he is quite adamant that the creative event, this divine creative event, is at work in the cosmic whole of things. Now, Wyman had quite an interesting influence. Just in terms of the Chicago school, I'll note Bernard Maitland, Daniel Day Williams, and also Bernard Loomer, each of which would go on to make significant contributions as process theologians, as process thinkers. And for our purposes, it's significant that Bernard Loomer would in fact be quoted in a 1969 Time magazine article titled Theology, Challenge in the Heavens, as saying, with respect to space exploration, that it may reinforce this notion, this idea, that man may not be the most important thing in creation. He says, say that out there we find persons superior to us, as we consider ourselves superior to dogs. Now, I'm not sure if he's referring to his own dog there, but it is an interesting statement, again, signaling an early openness by key process thinkers. Note that the date here, 1969, right around the time of the moon landing. So Wyman becomes an important influence, showing initial openness to this question. Well, I won't need to introduce Charles Hartshorne, I think, to this community, but Hartshorne was post-Whitehead one of the principal figures responsible for the development of process philosophy and theology. And you often hear Whitehead and Hartshorne uttered in a single breath, but I think it's important to emphasize that although he was his assistant, although Hartshorne was influenced by Whitehead, he came to a lot of his own processual insights independent of Whitehead. He's quite an original thinker in many ways, and has a vast corpus that I think is truly extraordinary. I've been wanting to have more time myself to investigate more into Hartshorne's thinking. But for our purposes here, it's truly interesting to see that Hartshorne was quite open to the reality of other worlds, of extraterrestrial life, and made a series of different statements that I think are worth recounting, at least in brief. So I'll give you just a selection here with respect to Hartshorne. So, for example, in his book Beyond Humanism, it's 1937, he states that panpsychism and theism, okay, at least in his form, implies the eternal existence of finite minds of some kind in the universe. And he adds to this that it could be verified by the discovery of other inhabited planets, right? If mind belongs in your ontology in a significant sense, then the claim that there be highly evolved minds elsewhere has there's a certain connection or through line there with respect to panpsychism and other inhabited planets, other minds in the universe. And perhaps we'll discuss that in our conversation time. In 1967, A Natural Theology for Our Time, he speaks of other inhabited planets, the non-existence of which we have no right to assume as also being included and loved by God, right? These other planets, other beings, other species are included within the divine embrace. In Creativity and American Philosophy, 84, he speaks of the present richly variegated universe with its probability of many inhabited planets. And in Wisdom and Moderation in 87, or Wisdom as Moderation, He inquires about a presumptive species on far-off planets, including parenthetically, I believe they exist. And he did this publicly quite often. I would point you all to the Center for Process Studies YouTube channel, where there's some wonderful lectures by Hartshorne. There's a great dialogue between Hartshorne and Cobb and Griffin, in which Hartshorne there would make certain statements publicly as to his openness with respect to this topic as well. And I point to one more statement by Hartshorne. This is a statement that comes as a response to a debate between Anthony Flew and Gary Habermas. This was an early debate on the resurrection of Jesus, in which Hartshorne says, I strongly incline to believe in rational inhabitants on some other planets. My view is not humanistic or anthropocentric. It's not earth-centered or what's called terracentric today. It is cosmic and God-centered. It is theomorphic and not anthropomorphic. So I think Hartshorne is a neglected resource for this conversation, and I would suggest that there remains a book to be written with a title something to the effect of Hartshorne and Extraterrestrial Life, a Hartshornian exo-theology. So perhaps something for further research in the future. Okay, well, let's turn to Lewis Ford, who was a very influential process theologian, making really substantial contributions, writing a number of texts and articles, as well as being well known as the co-founder for the journal Process Studies, which is alive and very much well today, and edited by Daniel Dombrowski currently. Now, for our purposes, Ford wrote a truly pioneering article, the title of which is Theological Reflections on Extraterrestrial Life in 1968, which I've located as really the first sustained consideration of this topic by a well-respected process thinker. And notice the time frame again. He writes this article presumably with this moon landing in view, with the energy surrounding space exploration and the need to comment on this new horizon that has opened up from the perspectives of process thought. So Ford cites this article saying it was originally given as a faculty research lecture in the spring of '68 at Raymond College of the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California, and was published in the Raymond Review. Now, I've searched all over for some time trying to find a record of the Raymond Review of this article, and I can find nothing online. And after being annoyed by this, I turned to the Center for Process Studies archives and was very pleased to find an older version of this article, really that we're housing this article in the archives there. But as we'll see here in just a moment, I'm also republishing this article as Appendix B in my recent book. So it's really worth taking a look at. It's quite detailed. I won't go through everything, but I want to comment on a few points that Ford brings up. So in the first place, he begins with this discussion of the nature of theological method. And he essentially makes the case that cosmology has to be relative to theology and vice versa, if this question of other worlds and extraterrestrial life is to be asked at all within this theological frame. And so he's going to push back at Bultmann's existential theology, for example, saying that if theology is really just about our own human existential relation to God and doesn't have implications beyond the human into the realms of cosmology, then we need to make an adjustment to how we think about theological relationships, theological sensibilities with respect to ourselves and others. He notes various shifts in the biblical text, in particular this shift from a God of a particular people, Israel, to a God of all creation, a God of the universe, right? He notes this trajectory and this widening that happens in the biblical narrative and in deep respects. He also reviews certain, at least in his time, advances in scientific cosmology, and he's noting some of the insufficiencies that he reads in standard understandings of evolution that, at least according to him, are inadequate in reasoning the rising complexity that we see, the novelty that is entering the evolutionary process. He also discusses God's cosmological function as persuasive towards greater complexification. He discusses the nature of life and what he says is the decisive difference between living and non-living matter in terms of response, of agency, of novelty. Okay, and really in a series of imaginative statements, he also signals what would become fascinating material in subsequent decades of this conversation. So just as an example, he speaks to extraterrestrial culture, technology, ethics, morality, economics, politics, interstellar communication, and even extraterrestrial comparative religion and religious experience and expression. So it's quite an interesting series of paragraphs. And again, the literature that is exploding now is targeting all different dimensions of this kind of material. So Ford early on is sort of pointing the direction of where certain thinking about this topic might go. Now, as a Christian theologian, he also points to certain theological issues that are raised for Christian faith, scriptural hermeneutics, the question of multiple incarnations, soteriology, resurrection in the body of Christ, cosmic kinds of ecclesiology, and even a kind of ultimate Teilhardian convergence of what he says are interstellar world civilizations. So very imaginative in scope. And it's worth noting that Whitehead, interestingly enough, does not figure as a name. He's not even brought up in Ford's article, although Ford is clearly operating out of a Whiteheadian framework. But in fact, Teilhard's name does show up, interestingly enough, and in this context at the end of the article. So Ford would republish at least part of this material in his book, 78 book, The Lure of God in the Context of Christology, which is a wonderful discussion. But if you are looking for the full scope of his article, I would point you to Appendix B in my recent book. I would say that Ford's article is wonderful enough to justify purchasing the book, but I also, of course, hope you enjoy the scope of the book as well and what I'm attempting to do. So Appendix B takes what was originally the Center for Process Studies' older account of this article, which had a number of errors, and is now figuring again here in Appendix B in an edited form. So it's a wonderful article. I recommend it to everybody, raising a lot of truly great questions. And again, is the first sustained, I think, contribution by a process theologian. Well, from Ford, let's move to another essential voice with respect to this history, and that is Norman Pittenger. So Pittenger was extremely important Anglican process thinker, wrote very widely on Christian appropriation of process theology. It's unfortunate, I think, that many of his texts now are harder to find. He's one of the best communicators to introductory audiences of the relevance of process thinking to all manner of contours within Christian faith. And I heard a rumor that Orbis Books is trying to reissue some of his texts. I think that's a very important thing to do. We don't want to miss out on his texts. Now, for the importance of Pittenger here is that he rivals Ford nearly in first raising this question of other worlds and extraterrestrial life within process Christian theology, although his considerations are far less sustained and overt than those of Ford. And I point in particular to a short article that appeared in the Christian Century in 1956 with the title Christianity and the Man on Mars. Note that Brenda Desler here describes this as the first religious periodical to deal with the question of extraterrestrial life. And I think this is quite an important statement if true, because it locates process theology, or at least a process theologian, Pittenger, at the origins of some of the more overt considerations of extraterrestrial life in the mid-20th century. And of course, it would explode beyond that too. And there's also independent evidence corroborating this that NASA's put out in terms of a history of literature. And Pittenger's article here appears quite early. So here's a portrait of that article. It can be found in the archives online for the Christian Century. And I'll note just a couple statements and questions he raises here. He says, how does the Christian gospel concerned with the salvation of men in this world have any universal significance when we know that there may be intelligent life on other planets? And this theological problem for Pittenger has been seriously misconceived because it's linked to a kind of Jesus-centrism or Jesus-centrism or planet-centrism, if you want, that restricts divine activity only to one man and to one planet alone. He thinks if we approach it from that perspective, we run into insoluble kinds of problems. So instead, he points us to the cosmic Christocentrism that is affirmed by the fathers of Christian theology. He demonstrates, at least in part through certain statements of the Nicene Creed and also the Gospel of John, why it is that we should be readily open to this kind of conversation. So he's arguing in part that Christian faith already has within it the cosmic sort of preconditions that allow this conversation to unfold in fruitful ways. So Jesus, for him, then defines but does not confine God in his relationship to the created world. And stated that way, we see much more possibility when it comes to thinking about other worlds. He says, we may therefore say that if there should be conscious, intelligent life on any other planet, God has not left himself without witness there, since by his word, the Logos, he both creates and sustains and also wills to make himself known in some fashion wherever he does create and sustain. We can say this because we know from our Christian faith and our own experience of God in Christ that it is the divine nature to give itself generously and insistently to its creatures. In fact, quoting a great statement by Hamilton King, he says, God may have other words for other worlds, but for this world, the word of God is Christ. Now, somewhat akin to Ford, Pittenger, in a few years later, would re-express his insights with respect to this topic in his wonderful Christological study, The Word Incarnate, 1959, which was very much influenced by Whitehead and Hartshorne. It is an early process Christology where he revisits some of these insights and the need for Christology in particular to be open to the challenges that other worlds and extraterrestrial life might raise. Okay, so a cosmic kind of Christology is what he's appealing to. Later in 1982 as well, Picturing God is a slim text, a wonderful introduction to process theology. And there he includes a note on God and other worlds where he revisits some of the statements he makes previously, in particular, the need for theology to move away from this more anthropocentric picture of God. Well, as with Hartshorne, I don't think I need to introduce these faces to you. The collaboration, of course, of John Cobb and David Griffin is quite deep and extremely productive throughout the years. And I would point you to, again, the statement that we opened with, that process theology is intending to take into account these modern space-time scales, to consider the reality of God, the meaning of our lives in this context. So in their 76 book, Process Theology, they don't include any overt statements with respect to extraterrestrial life, although you can discern a certain space of possibility that's open for them. They're open to this within Whitehead's philosophy. So, for example, they say there was real value and enjoyment in the eons of time before high forms of life appeared anywhere in the universe, and that the level and importance of enjoyment increased greatly when on this planet and wherever else a similar development may have occurred, animals and finally humans emerged. Okay, so an indication of a certain openness within this text, within Whitehead's thinking. If we look to Griffin's text in 89, God and Religion in the Postmodern World, he speaks of human beings being a part of this creative order. He says we're the crown of creation, at least in the sense that we're the chief exemplification, on our planet anyway, of the qualities that all creatures embody. He points to certain gradations of value as being significant in this context too. He says a hierarchy of values is presupposed in nature, and that this provides a certain basis for rejecting anthropocentrism, according to which other creatures have no value, essentially, or their only value is utilitarian value for human beings. So he rejects this, but argues that at the same time, this allows us to hold that human beings are intrinsically more important and more valuable than other earthly creatures. But of course, there's a certain double edge to this. By this logic, it would require us to also say that where there are highly more advanced creatures, in principle, they too would be more important and more valuable than us. We think back to Loomer's statement, right? Supposing we encounter civilizations and beings that would look to us as we look to our dogs, for example. So there's a certain trajectory of Griffin's comments here that we could build out, challenge in a certain respect. But this element of value is quite important. It is affirmed by both Cobb and Griffin, and it's a part of the developing conversation of extraterrestrial life. And I point to Griffin's statement here in 2014 from Panentheism and Scientific Naturalism. He says, on other planets, with the conditions of life to emerge and to evolve for many billions of years, we should expect there to be some with creatures that, no matter how different in physical constitution and appearance, would share some of our capacities, such as those for mathematics, music, and morality, or more generally, truth, beauty, and goodness, right? It's a wonderful statement about the potential axiological commonality between ourselves and extraterrestrial others, right? Have you ever imagined extraterrestrial mathematics or music or morality? This is, again, topics that are at the forefront of a lot of recent texts, topics that I at least comment briefly in my recent text. So this element of value being a connecting point between world civilizations. Now we saw Cobb and Griffin, attention to Griffin a little further. Let's now look at Cobb and Charles Birch, who also had a wonderful collaboration in the text, The Liberation of Life in 1981. And in this text, they document a discussion of life from the cell to the community to the cosmos at large. And they're deeply indebted here to both Wyman and Whitehead. And they speak of life as this cosmic power or a cosmic principle that works for higher order against entropic poles downward, right? So very much influenced by Wyman, as I discern it, with respect to this notion that there's a cosmic power that transcends entropy and works towards higher levels of novelty. Notice they say that when the conditions allowed, this cosmic principle, it brought forth living forms upon this planet, multiplied them until it transformed the whole surface of the earth. It brought forth human intelligence and transformed the earth once more. Probably it has worked similar miracles elsewhere in the universe, perhaps at many places. Okay, they continue. It can be assumed that where conditions allow in other planets circling other stars in this or other galaxies, life has worked its magic. Having observed life here, one can assume that it is a cosmic principle. Somewhere in the universe, there may be wholly different conditions that also make entirely different forms of life possible, perhaps even in empty space or in dimensions different from our own. Of such possibilities, of course, nothing is known. So they speak somewhat as Wyman spoke of God as the creative event. They speak of God as life in this context. So God can be conceived as life itself in a deep sense. And they do so in reference to Whitehead, saying that this Whiteheadian idea of God is appropriately called life, not only because this immanence of God in the world is the life-giving principle, but also because the life-giving principle is itself alive. So they argue that a lifeless principle could not ground itself or explain the urge to aliveness that permeates the universe, right? There's a connection from life to life in a deep sense, a metaphysical connection, we might add. So God is life, they say, does not aim specifically at the creation of human beings on our planet, so a rejection of anthropocentrism or terracentrism, but rather finds rich value in dolphins as well as human beings. And they say we cannot guess the forms of life that may have achieved on other worlds. Again, a deep sense of openness to the cosmic dimension of life, not just the divine life, but the achievement of life through evolution on all manner of worlds. Now, I point to a recent chapter that Cobb has written. This is a chapter titled Cosmic Life that appears in an edited volume by Bartosh, Grandpierre, and Pang, Towards a Philosophy of Cosmic Life, in which he revisits some of these central themes, I think, that initially were worked out with Birch in The Liberation of Life. And one thing he stresses here is that living should be understood in terms of a matter of degree in nature, such that the fundamental units of nature can be said to embody pre-life. I think that's quite important to this conversation because pre-life is not lifeless. Pre-life is not death. And even Teilhard himself used the language of pre-life, right? That all life emerges from pre-life, but there's an element of livingness to ontology. It's not an ontology of death, as Hans Jonas called it, reductive materialism, for example. That if we're to make sense of the evolution of life, we need to think of the elements of ontology having a domain or potency for being alive. If they're not alive in some sense already, we might get to that. Cobb says the cosmos as a whole includes fundamental features that make life possible and actual. It may not be alive in the same way that we are, but it grounds life in its eternal inclusion of novel potentiality. It is characterized by superlife. So I discern in Cobb's statements here a reference to the primordial nature of God as Whitehead conceives it, this ground for eternal novel potentiality. And he emphasizes, again, God as life by capitalizing life, or super life. That God is not a being itself per se, but life itself. That divine life without which no other life could at all be. So he concludes the article, and it's a short chapter, saying that the cosmos favors life, and that common sense seems to suggest that there was a cosmic decision in favor of life. Okay, that life is not some random add-on to the universe, but life is what the nature of this universe is up to, from evolutionary perspective, arguably from a divine perspective, certainly. Let's jump from Cobb then to Nicholas Rescher, who for many years has been a very prolific process thinker, a polymath from the University of Pittsburgh, and has an extremely rich corpus that has assumed not only the modern scientific cosmology as a framework, but also the process conceptuality of this setting. So Rescher is often written wider than Whitehead. He has several introductory texts to process thinking, process metaphysics, that include Whitehead along a much broader history of process thought. But he's really made some important contributions. He's still writing today, and does not seem to stop writing, actually. I believe he's in his 90s. In fact, John Cobb, I think you're beating him age-wise, but I think he's behind you in terms of that. But truly an interesting figure. Now, when you look at Rescher's corpus, you notice a continual aversion to what he's called an anthropocentric supposition. And I think this is shown by the fact that he speaks of beings or intelligent beings, intelligent creatures, without ever restricting being, intelligence, and creaturehood to our planet alone. So again, this is this cosmic scope in which he is writing. Now, for our purposes, I point to an early article in '85 titled Extraterrestrial Science, where he, among other things, considers whether science in a different planet or civilizational setting might overcome various limitations that are associated with our merely human science. It's a truly wonderful article, quite detailed and large, and I'll give just a sense for some of his statements, some of which I think are partly comedic. He says, the prospect that some astronomically remote civilization is scientifically more advanced than ourselves, or that somebody else is doing our sort of science better than we are ourselves, requires in the first instance that they may be doing our sort of science at all. And this is a deeply anthropomorphic supposition that's extremely unlikely. He says to endorse the idea of a scientifically superior extraterrestrial civilization is to step beyond the realm of scientifically plausible fact. The quest for superhuman science should bring home to us the uniqueness of that artifact, which is our human science. It should be stressed, however, that this consideration that our sort of natural science may well be unique is not so much a celebration of our intelligence as a recognition of our peculiarity. So I admire Rescher for wanting to push against the grain often, and being an original thinker in many of his writings. So I point just to a few relevant texts. He would return to some of this topic in Pluralism in 1993. He expand some of his insights. In his 1996 book, Process Metaphysics, he has a wonderful discussion, again, of the history of process thought. He has a chapter on process theology where he describes God as being linked to the world of created beings through reciprocity and effective appreciation, and responding to the world's eventuation by way of approbation or disapproval. But notice he's speaking of God and created beings. Again, he's not restricting created beings to Earth alone, but is seeing it from a much wider cosmic perspective. His more recent text in 2017, Metaphysical Perspectives, where he discusses a number of salient topics with respect to this question: rationality, intelligence, personhood, again, all of which are going to be seen from a cosmological perspective and not just a simply terrestrial or planetary perspective. So to be human, he says, is to belong to a particular animal species through operations of biological, psychological evolution. As such, humans exist only here on Earth. However, to be a person is something quite different and far broader. something determined by one's capacities and possibilities for action. Persons, he says, are beings that make their way in the world by means of thought, acting on the basis of their beliefs and choices. In principle, alien creatures, very different from humans, could be persons, okay, in this kind of sense that he's defining here. Now, that these persons arguably do exist on other worlds, I would argue it seems to be a part of Rescher's own metaphysics of axiological optimism. That is, he's picturing a universe that is striving for what is best, what is optimal axiologically. So I think he's very much open to this, although he voices certain questions that clearly remain. And I think this is somewhat comic. He says, you know, in the development, or if the development of intelligent beings is the telos of cosmic evolution, why are there not more of us on innumerable planets? And why are those presently here not a great deal more intelligent? Well, it may be the case that the universe is populated by innumerable planets that have life. So I think his initial question here about why are there not more of us is jumping the gun. Okay, we're working on that. And the question as to why we're not more intelligent, well, I don't know if I can help him with that one. Now, this openness notwithstanding, I would argue that in his universe, that's axiologically governed. It's one that's very friendly to not only intelligence as this value achievement on our planet and also other planets, but also intelligence in terms of a divine scope. He speaks in a number of his texts about the viability of a divine intelligence that's operating optimally towards value in a ubiquitous kind of fashion throughout the universe. So his 2010 book, Axiogenesis, is a nice place to start if you're interested in that axiological proposal, which I certainly am. Let's turn then to the wonderful collaboration between Theodore Walker Jr. and Chandra Wickramasinghe. Just a word about each of them. Wickramasinghe here at the bottom was for many years a close collaborator with the astronomer, the cosmologist Fred Hoyle, producing a number of wonderful texts. It was a great collaboration between them. And Walker, Theodore Walker here at Perkins School of Theology, has been writing for a number of years in the context of neoclassical metaphysics. So the tradition of Whitehead and certainly Hartshorne. I'd argue that Walker here is more influenced by Hartshorne than by Whitehead. And their collaboration here in The Big Bang and God is quite significant, I think, for thinking about process theology, a history of thinking with respect to cosmic issues, one of which is life and intelligence beyond Earth. And what they document well in this text is certain interdisciplinary convergences that are relevant to these intersections of astrobiology, cosmology, and theology. And they look to primarily Whitehead and primarily Hoyle and Fred Hoyle and Hartshorne in drawing some of their conclusions. So to give you a sense of this, they say this study of scientific literature by and about Sir Fred Hoyle and his collaborators shows how astronomy, biology, astrobiology, astrophysics, and cosmology converge with natural theology. And as advanced by constructive postmodern scholars, instructed by Whitehead and Hartshorne, natural theology yields biology and psychology with cosmological scope. So it's a deeply integrative work, pointing to certain convergences among our disciplines, even up to the level of cosmology and theology. So note that although Walker and Wickramasinghe don't consider intelligent extraterrestrial life in any significant sense in this book, they are pointing to certain, again, integrations of science, philosophy, and theology that are antecedently relevant to this conversation. So Hoyle and Wickramasinghe, for example, argued that biology cannot remain exclusively earth science. Rather, the study of life is extraterrestrial or commentary, they argued. It's astronomical or stellar or interstellar. It is both galactic and cosmological. And Hartshorne is added into this research in this text by both Walker and Wickramasinghe, who argue that Hartshorne agrees with physicists who dare to say that all nature is in some sense lifelike, right? And that there's no absolute new principle of life that emerges from non-life in some point of cosmic evolution. And as a sort of crowning dimension to their thought, all life, they say here, emerges from previous life and ultimately from the everlasting divine life. So how should we picture this divine life? Well, one way to do so is by looking at an image that's been circulating around the internet. This is a image picturing the totality of the universe, presumably. As to what's outside the bounds of this bubble, well, I have no idea, but it is quite an interesting image. And in this book, both Walker and Ramsing argue through a certain mereological analysis between part and whole, that God should be conceived as nothing other than the all-inclusive whole of reality. And they locate this in the tradition as well. So it's an affirmation of panentheism, where all that is actually real is included in God. As Anselm said, all things are in him, such that God is the one all-inclusive whole of reality. And Walker is signaling both Hartshorne and Schubert-Ogden's statement with respect to this phraseology. The divine whole of reality is greater than, because it is inclusive of and transcendent of, the sum of all parts of reality. And the universe is conceived as the sum, or the aggregate sum of all things of reality, or the cosmos, right? The aggregate parts themselves can be conceived as universe and cosmos, whereas the greater transcendent whole is God. And he, at least Walker, restates Anselm's famous claim that in this way, God is that than which nothing greater, nothing better or equal can be conceived. Now, they push back a bit at sort of naive forms of atheistic rejection with respect to this mereological distinction of involved in a panentheistic affirmation. I give one example. They say, where the word God refers to an all-inclusive reality, atheism is illogical and nonsensical. No sensation or observation, no experience denies what any scientific observation unavoidably confirms, at least implicitly, that we are existing, that we are parts of reality existing among other variously inclusive parts of reality. And according to logical and mereological analysis, all parts of reality are parts of the all-inclusive divine whole of reality. So panentheism for them becomes a way of including all that the cosmos is doing on this planet and elsewhere within the life of God. Well, I'll draw us to a close then by looking briefly to Roland Faber and some of his recent work on this topic. For those who are less familiar, Faber for many years was the chair of process studies at Claremont School of Theology, only recently retired and moved back to the home country of Austria. And Faber, his recent work at least, has shown a consistent engagement with a lot of the scientific, philosophical, theological layers that are relevant to this discussion. And he's done so always within Whitehead's context, but also beyond it in a significant religious sense. So while a lot of the discussion has operated from within a Christian framework, Faber is unique in that his work speaks from within the Baha'i faith and from the Babi traditions, which have vast and really beautiful statements as to the manifold of worlds that God is involved with, the manifold of spiritual beings on other planets. So it's really an amazing, relatively new religious tradition, but that is aligning with a lot of interest in modern cosmology. So the uniqueness of Faber's work in part is an integration of Whitehead's philosophical cosmology and the Baha'i faith, some of the intuitions of the Babi traditions. So I won't comment too much since there's quite a bit, but let me note just a couple texts and what's happening in those texts. So his recent book, The Ocean of God, in 2019, he's weaving together both ancient and modern sources to discuss what he says is the Earth and other worlds as a story of cosmic magnitude that's essential to the future of religion. This question of the future of religion, I think, is quite important with respect to this topic, assuming we do encounter or have the ability in some sense to encounter other kinds of beings. Religions should have a means of arguably of incorporating this. And you have a lot of texts arguing that religions are just going to die out, or this is going to be tremendously difficult for religion. Even Stephen J. Dick argues that. But many have argued, Faber included, that religions evolve into various kinds of revolutions: quantum revolution, Darwinian revolution, Freudian, if you want, unconscious revolutions, and that this step towards a cosmological revolution with respect to the fact that we're not alone is just the next step that the religion is going to take, that the future of religion must, in a deep way, affirm. So this is an excellent text, excellent discussion. Even more recently, 2021, the cosmic spirit, he's weaving together the interspiritual and the interstellar in a series of wonderful meditations that are provoked. What he says here is by this staring at stars, okay, and imagining the life of other days. So both are excellent texts I'd recommend to you. There's much larger discussions that are relevant to contemporary discussions in exotheology, astrotheology, etc. And his most recent text, which is monumental in scope, titled The Mind of Whitehead, is quite a wonderful contribution to the literature. And among other things, he insists that life for Whitehead is one of the universals of the universe, okay? What would it mean for us to say that life is a universal? This harks us back to the claim in some sense of Cobb and Birch, right? That life is a cosmic principle. So he speaks here of the openness of Whitehead's own cosmology to a multiplicity of diverse appearances and forms of life. And that we can see this in light of the reality of other world civilizations, right? In some sense, as an actualization of value, as an actualization of a certain divine aim for relationship, for communication, for revelation, etc. And he speaks rightly to Whitehead as being open to diverse magnitudes at which other life forms may appear. Examples, whole universes within infinite dimensions, even as minute as quantum events, or of infinite worlds full of life, or of life forms of the magnitude of the nebula. And here he's signaling a wonderful statement that Whitehead makes in discussion with Lucian Price. Again, Lucian Price's book, The Dialogues of Alfred North Whitehead, is a controversial text, but a wonderful text where Whitehead at one point speculates that even the nebula could be sentient entities, right? A very imaginative sense. So that's just a few statements about Faber. As we wrap up, let's ask, what can we say about these various statements that have been uttered, okay, by influential past and present process theologians? Again, this is not an exhaustive history. In many ways, the research is just beginning. But as signaled at the outset, I think these statements demonstrate within process theology, process philosophy, various dimensions of openness, a wonder and affirmation with respect to other worlds and extraterrestrial life. And so, in part, this fact demands more inclusion of the resources of process philosophy and theology in current literature. We began by speaking to a certain neglect of the literature with respect to process thought. So in part, my recent work, both here in Metaphysics of EXO-LIFE and the larger forthcoming volume, is wanting to launch this more inclusive endeavor and allow for a space for process thinkers, process theologians to enter this discussion and to make inroads and add in a fruitful way to, I think, a discussion that's only increasing as we hear more and more about scientific advance, as we speculate further about UFO phenomena, which is ever present, it seems. So I just think it's important that we make a contribution to this discussion. I've been writing a number of articles recently, book chapters that are bringing this material much more widely to the discussion. And I'll be at Star Island in New Hampshire for the IRAS conference next year, the Institute for Religion in an Age of Science, where I'll be discussing some of the relevance of process thought to this wider discussion. Now, to conclude, before we jump into some conversation, let me offer 15 thematic affirmations, just quickly, that I think emerge from these statements. There are affirmations that would not necessarily be affirmed by all the thinkers we just saw. There'll be different nuances, but I think we might see them as certain trajectories for further research and relevance when it comes to the insights process thought might offer to this wider discussion of extraterrestrial life. So the first is that matter and its antecedents should be conceived as dynamic, organic, and experiential in nature. Okay, that mind and mental activity are inherently part of nature. That the differences between life and non-life are matters of degree, organization, and complexification rather than kind. That both cosmological and biological evolution are oriented towards achievements of value as expressed in conscious life and intelligence. That what has occurred on this planet can and likely will occur on other planets where conditions are ripe. That value and hierarchies of value are a reality in the universe, that superior extraterrestrial intelligence is a live possibility, a live potentiality, and that the universe is exploring, we might say, inexhaustible possibility, structures of possibility in each and every moment. I think in part we have to say something along those lines. That cosmocentrism, more cosmological focus, overthrows more naive anthropocentric or terracentric tendencies, okay, belonging to our philosophies and religions. That terrestrial human disciplines, I think of science, philosophy, theology, religion, are contingent. They're terrestrially bound, but they're not irrelevant in nature. Okay, that metaphysics, cosmology, and theology are relevant to each other. Whitehead would even say that they need each other, that there's no shortcut to truth. We need the best of our disciplines. That God is to be conceived organically as opposed to mechanistically or supernaturally, okay? That God's organically related to the cosmos and what it achieves at all levels. That divine influence is cosmic in nature. It's immanent, persuasive, non-anthropocentric, and non-terracentric in nature. And that theological doctrines, whether incarnation, revelation, salvation, are open to being expanded and extended to other worlds and extraterrestrial life. And finally, that God's telic embrace of this universe is conceived as aesthetic, as beatific, and all-inclusive in nature. So again, these are just some thematic affirmation that emerged from this bullet point history of process theology and extraterrestrial life, each indicating certain trajectories of the conversation as it stands, but also, I think, trajectories of the future in which I think process thinking is going to make further contributions. So I thank you all for your attention. And Jay, I'm happy to follow your lead in the conversation or field some questions with respect to this material. So thank you very much, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew.